Greetings. This is Kingdom Cast, and I'm back here again with one of my friends back in Malaysia. So say hi, James.
Hi,
Yeah. So
nice
well,
to be back here.
yeah. I'm still trying to figure out this whole online thing. Um, Trying to normalize audio and a bunch of that stuff. So hopefully, this episode, alongside the topic, is also a bit of an experiment on how to maintain the dialogues that I can have with my friends. Uh,
I
Still thought,
mean, I mean, Honestly, you just need to come back, my man.
yeah. Work visa, man. One of these days, I guess we'll talk about immigration.
Well,
Yeah, yeah, because otherwise, we're gonna be stuck in this mode for quite a while. But anyway,
yeah.
in the meanwhile, let's talk about some other topic. So recently, we had a mutual friend, and it seems like they're doing a topic on discipleship. They're trying to figure out what works in discipleship, what people think discipleship, effective discipleship looks like in practice and whatnot. Um, I want to dial it back a little bit because I feel like we have not uh, successfully defined terms, right? So we've been throwing the words around. We've been talking, we've been saying, oh, you must be discipled, Christians, young or old, they must come under discipleship. We say that. I don't think we've ever really drew any hard line on defining anything. So uh, I'm gonna talk with you and discuss. Hey, what do you think discipleship are? What do you think people are doing that they call discipleship and might actually not be the case? Um, because I'm a pretty negative guy. I don't uh, I don't like to talk about positives. I'm here to talk about negatives. What are people doing? They say it's discipleship, but it's not. So why don't I throw that as the first cold open to you, James? We get discipleship. We get the word thrown around a lot. Um, and people kind of assume its meaning. What do you think people assume the meaning of discipleship is generally?
On my personal end, I just generally view it as, I mean, when I even as a baby Christian, I feel like I understood this pretty straightforwardly, where God would have some kind of Bible study, right? Some kind of involvement in that front.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, the more I think about how churches often run things, like if you see some churches, they're not actually looking at their Bibles when they're like, I mean, I guess the discipleship thing that frames in their mind, it's, oh, we're gonna study this week's sermon, like last week's sermon.
Right.
It's like, yeah, which, I mean, you don't really consider that uh Bible study per se. You're just you're relying on whatever your pastor has said in the previous week and just sort of running with it. And I guess also discipleship is often viewed as, if I were to frame it in this way, it ends up being sort of something where you journey with people. And I mean, like, it's not completely about the Bible. It does involve a lot of, yeah, the buzzword is journeying with people. I've heard this word for ages. Like, people just I'm journeying with this person or that
Right.
person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and here's the interesting thing that happens generally. Um, we describe the things we do, like reading the Bible, studying, uh, maybe last week, next week's sermon, preparing for those kind of things. Those are things we do when discipling. That is not necessarily what discipleship is per se, right? That's not the
Yeah.
work. Yeah, that's not the working definition of it. Um, and sometimes we don't even say what uh what is it a means to an end of, right? Discipleships
Mm.
discipleship has a direction. It's supposed to go somewhere. Um, and if you just study each week's sermon, uh, or just meet with a person one to one to kind of go through their emotions, go through their level of maturity every week or so. Sure, that is part of the things that's done in a quote unquote discipleship context, but that's not necessarily the be all end all. So I'm gonna
Mm.
let's tackle those things. What are the things that when people do them, they say, "Oh, we're doing it. We're doing the discipleship," but you're kind of not, right? You're kind of not necessarily doing discipleship. It's the same way in which, oh, I'm obeying God. That is one of
Mm.
those things a Christian does, but that's definitely not the be all end all of it, right? Um, if that's your only emphasis, you become, say, Pharisaical. If the kind of Christianity you're talking about, it only talks about obedience, right? That's one of the ditch it can fall into, where it becomes Pharisaical. It becomes about the doing. So discipleship often becomes this thing. It becomes the part of the whole. It becomes just that activity, right? So, uh, you got any other things you want to bring up other than what you just mentioned? Meeting up with a person, quote unquote, journeying with them, maybe emotionally, spiritually, whatever, um, and doing Bible studies on a weekly basis. Do you got any other example uh, of the things people do and then they call that discipleship?
Honestly, maybe. I mean, this is going to be a strange indictment, I suppose, on somebody. But this whole there's talk of digital discipleship.
Okay,
So the whole idea is that in seemingly some sense, somehow are still in dialogue and quote unquote journeying with people, even through text messaging, um, in a way that's not um, necessarily involving it. I wouldn't call that discipleship per se. I just call that you're just looking, you're just trying to advise people and chat with people. I mean, that's the that's the frame of mind that I think that. I mean, can you call that discipleship? I find that very hard to say. I do think that we have to bring things back to realize that discipleship really needs to be brought back into the context of an actual congregational church, an actual church
right.
setting, rather than, oh yeah, I'm texting so and I'm journeying with that person. Um,
Yeah,
yeah, I mean, that's not a. I don't think that's. I mean, at that point, anything can be called discipleship. I can call my friendship with you discipleship, I suppose. At that point, is
right.
that is everything discipleship now?
Right. Yeah. And so that's one of the ditch we fall into. Um, if everything is discipleship, then nothing really is, right? Uh, and of course, the common objection to those kind of things would be, oh, are you saying that I'm not discipling someone when I am talking to people about how they should engage in dialogue and conversation online and all that stuff? Um, and again, I'll preface by saying uh, the activity is not the thing, right? The things we do in discipleship doesn't define the whole, and so we need to be
Mm,
careful when we do talk about these things. When we talk about the activities that we do in discipleship, like Bible reading. Bible reading is good. No one's saying it's not. No one's saying you should stop, but that's not it. Bible reading is not discipleship. At least
mm,
that's not the be all end all of it, right?
mm.
Um, so here's a funny one that I kind of want to bring up. We're gonna talk about all the negative stuff. We're gonna talk about all the bad thing. This is gonna be absolutely useless. No, I'm sorry. That's a joke. We'll do some definition and we'll do the the typical what do you call it call to action at the end. Um, because of retention span and all that. But one of the first one I want to bring up is how usually when it comes to the discipling, the primacy is given to the feeling of the one that's being discipled, right? You need to care for how they feel. You need to ask them how they feel. All these things have to be communicated. And generally, you shouldn't trample on it, right? There's this weird kind of uh, apprehension to offend the person that's being discipled. And I want to bring up instances where that's simply not the case. So in John 6, uh, around the end there, around verses 30 onward, um, Jesus is talking to a crowd. So if you don't know the context, he just fed 5,000. They came back, and then Jesus starts saying some really difficult things. Things like, if you don't eat my flesh and drink my blood, you cannot be my disciple. You cannot follow me. All those kind of things, right?
Hmm.
So the people, they begin to leave. They probably start going in their head, the heck is this guy talking about? And they bounce. When they do bounce, um, this is what Jesus actually said to the rest of the uh, later on apostles, the closer disciples, right? The text says, from that time, many of his disciples went back and walked no more with him. So again, they got offended, they got weirded out, maybe by the hard teachings, and they just left. They just up and like, you know what? I don't like this guy anymore. Their emotions were hurt or something along that line. Maybe even
I
intellect.
I don't I don't want to play with you anymore.
Yeah. So and it could be intellectually as well, right? They could be intellectually offended with the whole um what is this whole eating and drinking him and all that kind of junk. So they left, and then Jesus said Jesus to the 12. Okay, so he says this even to his closer disciples, his closer circle. He says, "Will you also go away?" Right? He's kind of arcing them. It's like, "Oh, look, they're leaving. You wanna join? Go, leave." Right?
Hmm. Hmm.
This goes in contrast with how a lot of people treat discipleship, right? There's this sense of like, oh, you want to be like the rest, you're not worthy, you easily get offended. Um, then don't stick around. This ain't for you, right? Um, I feel like this is severely missing in a lot of our ways of discipling. Uh, you got any thoughts on this matter?
Well, there is a real sense in which that if we talk about the whole idea of like being offended and sort of like delivering the message to them, I suppose, even in a one-to-one context or whatever context you may be, there is for certain a point where you the message just has to offend, and you kind of, irrespective of what that person thinks. I mean, like, you can't tell me you're gonna like if let's say like for example you're gonna go through like a book study on maybe, yeah, John, right, John,
Right.
and if you were to reach the passage that we just talked about, which yeah, it's John 6
Yeah.
verse 65 to 68, and the essential point being made is that you're offended. Maybe this isn't for you. Maybe
Right.
you should. Maybe you should leave. Um, but of course, thank God. Otherwise, we don't have the Bible. They said no. Only you have the words of eternal life, right?
Right.
But the thing is that well, there is a point of time where it's like, if you were, how are you gonna actually, practically speaking, prepare people to be like, okay, so this is probably gonna offend this person. How am I gonna do that without potentially watering down what is actually being said inside the passage?
Yeah. Um,
It's a genuine, like, how do you avoid that? I don't think you can.
yeah.
If you're going through the passages, you're just going through the passages.
Yeah.
Not void of emotions, definitely, but It's
Um,
just going through the passages.
yeah, and the point
Yeah.
is the fact that the feeling of the people being discipled, frankly, doesn't matter. Let's be honest, right?
Mm.
Uh, Jesus is calling the people who are quote unquote following him to actually follow him, right? Because what's the accusation at the beginning of the chapter? He says, "You come to me looking for perishable food, but I'm
Yeah.
here and I'm telling you, you don't get to do that, right? You don't get to be discipled by me looking for perishable food. You need to look for food that does not perish." And he presents it again in a way that might offend the people's theology in a way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Do we do that? As people who say that we're discipling someone, do we theologically offend them? Not for the sake of offending, but so that their thinking is more conformed to Scripture. So when people go around and say things that might not be biblical, right? Some silly stuff like, oh, God helps people that is willing to help themselves, but
Mm-hmm.
that's not there. Do you, as a good teacher, you are called to say, hey, the Bible doesn't really give us that kind of framework, doesn't really give us that kind of mindset. Or
Mm-hmm.
are we genuinely scared and we just thought, I guess we'll iron that out when I have the chance, because I might, offend this guy too early on and he might jump off the boat too soon. And here's the point: Jesus doesn't care. If this sale isn't for you, then get off now, right? And he is not afraid to say that, and I think that's an important point I always want to bring out: the fact that Jesus is not the flower child preacher everyone thinks he is. He's like, you wanna leave like them, go. He doesn't have time for that kind of nonsense. So I thought that was interesting. um
Yeah, I would add that actually, I mean, if anything, the like I think the latter impulse is for most of people. I mean, even outside of the context of discipleship, somebody openly said that, like just in public in general. I think no one would, I mean, no one would be remotely willing to just immediately be like, actually no, that doesn't actually fly. Like nobody would, nobody's gonna confront the guy unless it's like because people will just be like, it's like that's not quite correct, but
right.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's sort of a silent. It's like comes out, and then because it's in public and it's like I don't want to offend this guy or anything like that.
Yeah.
I will admit, I think I've probably fallen into it a few times myself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it comes up a lot. And my concern actually is the fact that we actually discipline the people that would otherwise confront false theology, right? Let's say they are doing a discussion and a lot of people are parroting unbiblical ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Someone brings up that, hey, that doesn't fly, that doesn't jet with the rest of the Bible. He's the one who's gonna get the talk of, hey, chill out. You, you know, you need to watch your tone. You need to be at the speed of the others, right? Uh, and
So this sounds like your early days in Xiamen, Marco.
oh, well, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for I'm sorry for projecting. This episode is essentially just me projecting. Yeah, but genuinely though, that is a problem. Uh,
Mm.
you can't imagine someone taking Jesus aside and be like, "Yo, Jesus, do you even want to have any followers at all? Can you like tone down a little bit, at least like give it a year or so for them to think about all the stuff you're teaching before you give them any difficult stuff." There's like I feel like we get none of those, um, and that's just not a consideration. So
Mm.
so we kind of need to get rid of that from our considerations. Um, the whole idea of like slow down to meet with the people you're discipling. I'm sure there's a point in saying, okay, I need to talk at a level where the people I'm teaching understands me. But
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that by no means requires you to make scripture any less sharp than it needs to be. And I'm sorry, we say that word a lot, sharp. The Bible is a two-edged sword. Okay, I'm sorry, you're gonna get cut a lot around it. So
Uh-huh.
so don't act like you didn't sign up for this thing, right? That's exactly what Jesus was on about. Hey, this offends you? You get off this top right now. Because it's gonna get bumpier. It's gonna get worse. I'm gonna start telling you that you need to die. You're gonna need to lose your life, right? So if they're not ready for even this part, Jesus literally just saying you need to not look for perishable things, then guess what? They're not at all gonna be ready to be told that their life is one of those things that's gonna perish and they're gonna have to let go. So yeah.
On a slightly positive note, I've definitely heard this preached in front of people who are, I mean, they're actually homeless. I mean, like this is like back in 2018 when I heard this.
Yeah.
The guy actually said this out loud and preached this to homeless people who were they were they were doing they were feeding them food uh, at least once a week on a Saturday.
Hmm.
So that ends up being that uh, it was a pleasant surprise to hear that. That was a long time ago, but there have been cases that I mean, just on a positive note, at least there is still some backbone left,
Yeah.
even with people that they're so called serving.
Yeah. And again, that's good to hear because it's important. Um, if nowadays people are called to give that kind of sermon, right? To tell uh, poor people who are struggling to even have um, normal means like bread and a shelter and all those things. And then you tell them,
Uh-huh.
hey, guess what? Christianity tells you that you shouldn't strive for these things anyway. Uh, a lot of people are worried they're going to offend most people and say, oh, are you saying we shouldn't care for them? All these kind of stuff. All those caveatism, um, it shouldn't be there. As a preacher, you need to have a certain level of boldness to just say it straight, right? And again, that's not ignoring other commands for us to provide for the ones in need. So that same preacher should be strong enough to turn to us who have uh, needs, who can provide, to say, hey, if your brother is hungry and you withhold him your material goods, then the love of the Father is not in you. That's also a difficult saying. That's also practically saying you're not saved, you're not a Christian. Um, but you need to have that kind of rhetoric because that's literally in the Bible, right? So let's move on a little bit fast. Um, there's other instances where this is also true. Uh, Jesus, when talking about his death, Peter says, "No, teacher, you surely would not die." All these things, and then he says, "Satan, get behind me." And then there's another one. I think it's John 13. Yeah, it's in John 13:8. This is when Jesus is confronting a lot of who's going to be greatest in the kingdom? And Jesus says, well, the greatest should serve, right? And in
Uh-huh.
John 13, Jesus disrobes like a slave and then proceeds to offer to wash the disciples' feet. In verse 8, Peter starts talking back. He says, Peter said unto him, thou shalt never wash my feet. Jesus answered him, if I wash thee not, thou hast no part with me. This is interesting, right? Because a lot of people would probably see Peter as being pious. No, Jesus, it's, my feet is not worthy to be touched by you. But what is Peter denying, right? What is he doing when he is denying Jesus in these things? Jesus said he's going to die. Jesus said, if you want to be great in the kingdom, you have to serve. And then he proceeds to do something that slaves do, which is wash feet. Wash feet, sorry. He,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
he is rejecting Jesus' discipleship. He's rejecting what Jesus has been teaching all along by saying, hey, you want to be my disciple? You want to follow me? You have to die, right? The student is not greater than the teacher. The slave is not greater than the master. If the master has to die, the disciple has to die. If the master has to serve like a slave, so does the disciple. So when Peter is saying things like, no, you're not going to die, no, you don't wash my feet, he is, regardless intentional or not, denying all those things that will make him a disciple of Jesus, that Jesus requires of his disciple. Dying, serving others, washing others' feet, right? Putting others above oneself, becoming a slave, becoming like unto a slave, uh, in terms of serving others and whatnot. And Jesus doesn't go the whole route of, well, I guess if this is not your thing, we can improve on other parts of you, Peter. No, right. Constantly, it's always, you're Satan, get behind me. If I don't wash your feet, if I don't serve you in this manner, and you refuse to serve others in the same manner I have served you, you're not my disciple, right? Cut, kill, discipleship done. And so I feel like this is also another one of those things severely missing. It's gone. It's, frankly, I've never heard anyone, well, other than some of the ones that I do believe are doing discipleship properly. 90% of the times, this is missing in majority discipleship context in Malaysia. You
Mm.
got any takes from what I just said?
The 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 feeling is that maybe actually let's not go that far. Let's just go talk about youth programs. There is a sense in which I do think that we should that one has to consider the needs that uh, that 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 young people. Oh my lord, I sound so old saying that. But yeah, am I that old?
Nah,
When we think about youth programs and all these sort of things, I mean, people tend to cater to the youth, and there is a good way of catering, which is that there's like certain needs and things that actually need to be filled up, the gaps that are filled up in, I don't know, maybe at home their parents can't really address this, so maybe the youth pastor or whoever is handling their youth group or whatever, they have to fill in the gaps. But on the other hand, there's a very bad kind of catering, which is that uh, to make it interesting, you try and cater to their tastes and wants, and so-called, like, yeah, their tastes and wants. I mean, as I've learned over the past few years, people young similar to me have switching tastes, switching ideals, and we're all over the place. We can't completely trust uh, us when we're younger to actually know what we necessarily want, or
right,
necessarily even be uh, so-called, like, know what we're lacking per se. I don't think I think it's already hard enough as an adult to make an accurate assessment of how good or bad you are.
right.
Try and scale yourself down to their age at about like 16 or 17.
Yeah. And so,
It's still hard.
yeah. And so there's that thing where, again, to make a caveat, we're not even talking about those times where, let's say, someone proves that they want to delve into music, right? And we actually properly disciple them on what pursuing music in a Christian way looks like, right?
Uh-huh.
Pursuing a level of mastery, a level of uh, thanksgiving that would otherwise be worthy of a Christian delving into music. We're not talking about that. We're talking about those things you must do as a Christian. And a lot of those things we don't want any what we don't want to do anything with, right? Just like Peter. Peter doesn't want to have anything to do with this whole dying and washing feet and serving others and all that stuff. And so he denies it in the Lord Jesus. And Jesus constantly, you know, calls Peter to get over those things, right? Get over himself. This is part of the job. This is within the paycheck. So when we do uh, meet young disciples who are doing things they shouldn't be doing, and I could name a lot of things, but I don't really want to get into specific. Uh, you probably can find it, whatever it is, being selfish, being uh, probably rash like Peter is, or being dismissive of certain biblical commands like Peter also is. You have to tell them no. You're being like Satan right now. You're being possessed like Satan, or you will not have any part in Jesus if you deny these things. And so,
Let's just, I mean, let's just bring it down to maybe a context that maybe we sort of, I guess, we still sort of relate to, like when people, I mean, I guess I don't know how. It'd be nice to see who our viewership would be like, but basically, if you think about people who are about in their 20s or even their 30s, like if the funny thing about those who are dating Christians dating at this point, there seems to I don't know what possesses people to think this way that you're date if you're even trying to date or whether you're going towards dating, but at the moment it doesn't work out, kill,
yeah,
cut off,
yeah,
separate, gone. It's
hmm,
like you have I liked it how I mean our mutual friend Matt had said you're functionally excommunicating each other,
yeah. And so,
and that's as unbiblical as it gets, and people don't confront that. It's a norm within Christian churches, and it runs rampant in the youth in its own right. People functionally excommunicate each other. I see people who actually go to different services over the fact that they broke up. How does this even make any sense?
yeah,
You're supposedly you're not even husband and wife. You're not divorced. Sounds like a grand divorce at that point. It's and I mean, granted, this has definitely happened to in this case to to a bunch of people, but I mean, I wouldn't deny that this has somewhat happened to me as well, which doesn't make a lot of sense. This is unbiblical as it gets,
yeah,
and nobody would dare to throw an injunction against it.
yeah. So those are one of those things, right? When emotions get in the way, the people discipling are too often unwilling to like be like Jesus and say, cut that off, right? When you make your emotions the standard, then yeah, you're gonna act in ways that subverts a lot of biblical authority. Hey, the church at large gets to excommunicate and do all these things. Hey, the church at large can call people to reconciliation, but they're not doing that. They're like, oh, those two need time apart from each other. So we're gonna artificially facilitate that. It's like, okay, will you be able to facilitate that in heaven? If you can't learn to reconcile here on earth, then to be like Jesus, I will say, then you have no part in heaven, right? There's not gonna be a time where you get to facilitate some kind of arbitrary separation or a lack of a desire to reconcile just because, oh, she or he hurts your feelings, fails to reciprocate, all that kind of jazz, right? Again, don't care. Jesus does the same thing. Oftentimes, when he faces a certain kind of racism, a certain kind of uh, ethnical superiority among his disciples, right? He goes through Samaria and he tells people a racially charged parable that the priest and the Levite are not willing to help this man who is half dead. The one who is willing to help is the Samaritan. And then he calls the people, hey, who is the one that loves his neighbor? Or, sorry, who is the neighbor in this parable? And the answer is the Samaritan, the same people that just denied them entry through their city, right? Just because they exhibit animosity towards you doesn't mean that God's law does not apply to them. God calls you to love your neighbor, and that's also to the Samaritans, these people who they consider ethnically inferior in every way. So your feeling and your social dynamic and your culture and all these things really doesn't matter a lot, right? And that needs to apply as well in our congregation, right? If certain people fight because, oh, there's a cultural barrier and you feel like, I don't think that's going to be reconciled this side of heaven and whatnot. They say those things a lot, right? Maybe that's a that side of heaven type of thing. That's not there. Uh, you're given a ministry of reconciliation, we're told. Okay,
Mhm.
so reconcile. That's your job. Uh, and you're not allowed to shimmy around the corners about those kind of things. Yeah. I think we can move on then if you got nothing more on that. So another,
I mean, I guess that would be. I mean, don't get us wrong. I mean, it hopefully there. If you talk about reconciliation, hopefully there is a sense in which at least one party is trying, and at bare minimum, if that is there is one party that desires to do so, but the other party doesn't. I suppose that's a kind of situation where I mean,
yeah, and well, the
how much can it be done?
the disciple needs to tell that kind of person, hey, your attempts at reconciling will be rewarded, right? Um, by God, that is. You need to do it because you're called to do it, and you
Mm,
don't need to care about whether or not that same effort is reciprocated by your neighbor. You just need to care that you are obeying God first and foremost in regards about your neighbor.
mm,
So, yeah, another topic I want to tackle, and I think we can end it on this one, um, is actually what I would call confessionalism. So,
mm,
there's a large, I feel like, in terms of theological discipline, there is a big hesitancy to call young Christians to commit to a particular confession, right? We talk about this quite a lot. I'm Presbyterian, you're Lutheran,
yeah.
and we are those things. You can argue because we read most about those things, or we're convinced about those things, or we think that way, whatever. Um, you can't escape the fact that, yeah, maybe those were some of our first uh, encounters with spiritual discipline in terms of Christianity, right? Maybe that is how I grew up, which I grew up my whole life in a Presbyterian church. I don't think it's absurd, and I wouldn't be offended if someone says, oh, of course you grow up to be Presbyterian. Um, to that kind of person, I'll just say, okay, feel free to challenge me, right? And this,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. But I think people are afraid that this becomes sectarian. Um, I think the bad part is the fact that people immediately assume that subscribing to a confession is inherently sectarian. Um, I don't know if you observe the same thing. How about on your side? Do you observe this kind of hesitancy to commit to a confession, theological framework, anything along that line among your circles?
definitely lies in the fact that I definitely like people who just want to be called Christian and nothing else. But you see, uh, okay, newsflash, we all call ourselves Christians. So am I lesser than you for committing to something that has a confessional background? And when you think about it, if we take church history into context, I suppose if we sort of frame it as God's working through the church in church history throughout and refining the fire of the church, are you going to tell me that you want to decide to so-called go back to ground zero? That's the implication that they make.
Yeah.
I'm going back to the time of the apostles. I'm a Christian. I'm a Baptist that is going to baptize only non-infants. I'm gonna I'm gonna set up house churches from the ground up
Yeah.
and have no backing, whatever. It's just me and my Bible. Now here's the big problem here. On one hand, I feel like you're completely disrespecting the Holy Spirit's work in the church by disregarding all of the work that fellow Christians of the past have actually cultivated and done. You are actually disrespecting God for, by saying, you know what, all these treasures and things that you have constructed through my fellow brothers and sisters in the past, let's just throw that away.
Yeah.
Let's just toss that aside completely.
Yeah. Right.
And the thing is that because I would say at least in the Malaysian context, at least Asian context. I don't know. Like let's just be honest. Most people don't like confrontation, and whenever they see these divisions, they see these divisions as things that are irreconcilable. So it's like, okay, we should just pretend like we can sing kumbaya and have our way with that.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so, it's a funny thing because you say it tongue in cheek. Oh, we're just gonna be the most first century type Christians ever. But it's like, well, okay. Even first century Christians have different emphasis when they're teaching. I'm pretty sure. Um,
Yeah.
and again, I think generally it's like what you said. They actually refuse to be sharpened. Hey,
Hmm.
is it pleasant when you're being sharpened by one another? You assume that. I don't think we're necessarily supposed to believe that it's supposed to be a always a nice experience to be sharpened of one another, right? But the Bible definitely calls us to sharpen one another. Does that include theological discourse? I don't think you can say that it doesn't. Or I don't think you can say, well, maybe it is, but I don't want to go there ever. Right? There's another one of those things where you want to be discipled. These are one of those things you don't get to say you don't want to partake in, right? And so it's important to tell that to people when they're like, I just want to be as pan Protestant as possible. Well, okay, you still need to defend the idea of Protestantism against Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, then, right? In other
Yeah.
words, you are still drawing lines. Nobody escapes drawing lines, even if that offends people. Again, we always go back to this idea, right? Um, and so, one interesting analogy I've thought about when thinking about this is, those children coloring books. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
when your children wants to learn how to draw, they can't. They have not begun how to draw. They don't know anything about proportions and all that jazz. You give them those coloring books. The lines are already drawn, right? Because it doesn't matter if you give your child a blank sheet of paper, some pencil, and some paintbrush, and let's say you put a picture of, I don't know, Finding Nemo or something, and it's like, oh, just look at that for a long time, and then just start drawing, and they're not gonna get pretty far. They're not gonna get far at all because they don't know where to start, right? They can't draw proportions. They don't even know where to start drawing. It's a pretty helpful tool to have the lines drawn somewhere, and then you just start coloring. and then you just start mix and matching colors, and then maybe experimenting once you start to know about composition and all that stuff. But we don't do that as Christians. As Christians, right, we treat young disciples, these people who hasn't even begun to learn on how to draw lines, right, how to refute heresy, how to tell when something is heretical or not. We treat them like tabula rasa, like these blank sheets of paper that will eventually figure themselves out. But guess what? We have confessions, we have historical creeds, right? Those are the coloring books. They draw the line for you, which is safe for you to color in, right? You want to dance, you want to color whatever color you want to experiment within the line. The confessions and the creeds say you can do that this far and no farther, right? It helps you build that framework, that biblical framework, even when you're young, even when you don't remember most Bible verses, even when you don't even remember the contents of the book your pastor just preached to through last week, right? And so instead of it becoming a tool that does help younger Christian to cultivate their faith, it becomes the boogeyman where it's like, well, if you start delving too deep into this, you're gonna become sectarian and you shouldn't be like that and all these kind of things. Well, I'm sorry. Uh, then you are not taking dominion, right? The tool, instead of becoming something that is a help, is a good thing, acknowledging that the Holy Spirit has worked throughout, the throughout the years and has been able to convince all kinds of minds and thinking patterns and all kinds of behaviors and say, hey, all these things could be true, all those other things are not true, and you should refute them and you should stay within this kind of line, this kind of circle. But we're straight up like, we don't like drawing lines. That's sectarian, that's divisive, uh, that's exclusive, that, puts people out of the circle. Well, maybe some people should be put out of the circle. We don't consider that. Maybe the not everyone gets to say I'm a Christian, because this is definitely true when we encounter cults. Nobody's gonna be like, you shouldn't confront a Mormon when they come to your circle and say we're Christians. Yes, you should. What do you mean? That's blasphemy. That's an attack on sacred scripture. So, okay, can it look in a can it happen in a friendlier manner? Right? Let's say they are not Mormons; they just have different understandings when it comes to sacrament and all those things. Can you not draw lines and not have it be antagonistic? And if not, then why not? The problem, I don't think, lies in the idea of confessionalism, right? I think it might lie in a kind of confessionalization where you basically want to say, well, our group thinks this way, and if you don't think this way, then you're not our group, right? Which I would argue
Hmm.
does happen sometimes. What's your take on that? You got anything to say about that?
Well, there's definitely a tendency if you, I mean, if you're, I mean, there's definitely that tendency among even like less confessional people who just so happen to adhere to the 5 points of Calvinism, and then it's like they draw a line, they draw much more arbitrary lines if we're really be honest.
Right.
It's like, oh, charismatics, no, but everyone else, should be okay, kind of ish. It's
Yeah.
like, oh, Methodists, nah, fam. It's like it becomes a lot more arbitrariness. Can it be cordial? I think it can be. I mean, at this in this day and age, you and I are not warring against one another
Right.
naturally. But
And that's
and I
talking.
think no, I mean I think that's a fairly good development in the sense that we all still acknowledge one another's Christianity, one another,
Yeah.
but we're mature enough to talk about things different our differences.
Yeah.
So we have a natural sense in which okay, we can talk about it and let's just keep and we'll keep dialoguing and see what how we understanding one another, and obviously one should still strive for some kind of unity, but
Right.
there's a general sense in which you can keep I can keep my convictions, you can keep your convictions. Hopefully we just move forward in some way, shape, or form as time goes on.
Yeah. Uh, and so that's the thing, right? We live in a time of unprecedented freedom. Back
Mm,
then, people like us, you and I, just because of difference of conviction, we'd go to war with each other, fellow Christians, right? Uh, and sure, that's a really sad thing to consider. The fact that these people call themselves Christians, they believe that they're gonna meet each other in heaven, and yet due to certain political, social reasons, religious reasons, they have to go to war with each other, and those kind of things. Yeah, that's a bad thing, and that was back then. Now we're more free. Now we're actually able to discuss and have discourse without, you know, killing each other by the end of it. Why do we refuse to have them then? Right? That's kind of the sad thing where we deprive ourselves of the actual freedom. Now that discourse, now that stark theological discourse is not deadly, we stop doing them. Why do we do that? Right? I think it has to keep it has to keep going. We can't just be like, oh, see, people used to kill each other over that, so now we just don't do that anymore. Well, no, now's the time to do it because theological discourse is again not outside of the table. You still need to discuss. You still need to mature. You still need to sharpen one another. That's still a call, a perpetual call that is included in discipleship. And so when we talk about these things, I'm sure there are those people who are actually sectarian. Uh, they seen people draw really good circles, and what do they want to do? They just want to draw smaller and smaller circles and exclude everyone. Um, I would categorize that in a different word, right? I would categorize those as the confessionalization, the kind of people who want to say, well, if you don't believe things the way I do, then you don't get to say you're part of my group. I'm like, number one, I don't care. Your group looks lame anyway. Second of all, I'm pretty sure you literally can't do that with any Christian movement or discipline ever at all, right? I'm Reformed, I'm Presbyterian. I'm very convinced there's a lot of things I disagree with someone like John Calvin and John Knox. Admit that. Stop doing this whole thing of like, oh, we're the most accurate version of nobody is. Not a single person, let's say Calvinism or Reformed theology, not a single person in Malaysia that I've talked to who is Reformed or is Calvinistic or even Presbyterian, who are magisterial, who believes in a kind of magisterial reform uh, office, right? So yeah, all of you on this point disagree with Calvin, so you don't get to play this whole game, right? Uh, and so these are people who have not learned how to draw proper lines, right? Draw lines without it being so sectarian that you literally cut off the founders of your discipline. Uh, and I think those kind of problems arise. Why? Because we already deter people from actually drawing within the lines, right? We already tell them, hey, don't read those stuff. Those stuff are divisive. Well, okay. Because of that, they don't get sharpened. Their minds are not matured, and that's the inevitable thing. Uh, it's an inescapable concept, right? Uh, it's not the case whether will we draw lines or not. Everyone will always draw a line. It's just whether or not you will draw them properly or not. And if you want to draw them properly, learn from history, from other theologians, from other Christians, because they have learned how to draw lines without radicalizing, without being sectarian in those activities, right? Saying, I will not have my conscience be bound by the church or by the general public, but I'm gonna admit they're Christian. I'm gonna admit they're not engaging in something that's unchristian in thinking, right? It's just that my conscience, as informed by scripture, refuses to believe in this or that thing a certain way. So those are one of those things we need to again train among ourselves. Was there anything, any final thoughts on this segment of the topic?
I mean, when I think about this, how would I put it? When I talk up, I mean, we're still talking in the context of discipleship. I think it's just dishonest to think that you can that that somehow you can disciple people into a general Christian of some sort. Like we're those who choose to decide to have no to not have their disciples submit to a kind of confessional background or a creedal background of some way, shape, or form are nothing but blind guides.
Yeah,
They're nothing but blind guides, and they're pointing people to on a they're pointing people to a map, like as if they cut. How would I frame this? If it's like as if the people who are deciding to point to disciple people and put them into a general Christian framework, whatever that means, it's like as if they're trying to make them read a map that ultimately they themselves can't read.
yeah.
So
It's
I'm a how do you call it? I'm a non-denominational Christian and I'm trying to disciple people in whatever shape or form. I try to troll with I know of the creeds, but I decide to just put them away and then like, hi, let's just go back to the Bible. It's like you're guiding people on a map that you yourself are basically saying that I can't read.
yeah. Uh, Maybe an example is you're using the atlas. Uh, you're
Mm-hmm.
using some kind of map, and then you start pointing and using it to denote locations. But you
Mm-hmm.
also say, hey, ignore all those names and markers, right? It says Antarctica over here. Ignore that. All the lines, all those roads, all those borders, they're not real. They don't exist. You ignore that. What matters is you know where you're pointing. Well, the lines and the borders are there to help you discern landmarks. Right? If you can't tell your landmark, then you can't really arrive at where you need to be. And again, like I said, you gimp the tool. That's supposed to be a tool. And sure, you might say eventually you need to grow out of it, right? I would argue, yeah, at some point, Protestantism needs to end, right? At some point, all of Christianity needs to be Catholic in some sense, definitely not Roman. But that's not going to happen by ignoring all the headways we've already made along the way. So, yeah, I think that's generally a good point to end it on. Um,
I'll just add maybe I mean to sort of put it in the frame of I mean two ways. I think one on congregation and one hand on a historicity sense. Let's start with the historicity sense. Like the point that you made that Protestantism does need to end at some point. I mean, we would be foolish to think that we're living in 16th century, 17th century era, and we're just perpetually trying to divide and keep ourselves away from those stinking Romanists or whatever that kind
yeah.
of thing.
Mhm.
And we would be foolish to think that change has happened,
Yeah.
and we should actively seek unity. But and the only way to do that is to actually do the proper theological discourse, stand on the things that are naturally our creedal and confessional backgrounds as our lines of guidance. Uh, yeah, things like that. And probably on the pastoral sense, I mean, I like to think that I mean pastors definitely need to start off by adhering to their confessional traditions
Yeah.
as strictly as possible, and they need to be able to disciple people.
Yeah.
So nobody is discipling people into a general Christian framework, so called.
Yeah.
We have to we have to let that go, and that's why I think maybe in a sense, um, maybe that is why in a sense the Oxford Confession sort of states that in its Article 14, where those who are administering the sacraments and and preaching preaching the word, technically speaking, unless they are validly ordained, it's not something that they should be exercising authority in that way.
Yeah.
I mean, I can see the wisdom behind that because, in a sense, yeah, discipleship should function within a congregational context.
Hmm.
Maybe the real problem is partly is that the church has sort of abdicated its role. I mean,
Yeah.
in a lot of ways, from
Discipling.
maybe from discipling, whether it's lack of Bible studies or whether it's deciding that you don't need to you want to either get rid of the liturgy or you want to not explain what the liturgy even means.
Yeah.
Things like that. You
Yeah.
abdicate your role, somebody's gonna have to try and fill in the gap, and normally that's in some weird way parachurch or organizations that have no business.
Yep. And so that's the thing, right? Um, Discipleship, as you mentioned, is a really good point. Needs to happen in a community setting.
Mm,
No, we're not saying everyone should think the same or act the same way. We already refuted that early on. But
mm,
you really can't divorce it from your daily walk. And that means you can't divorce it from all the people you're going to meet throughout the week and all the people you're going to worship with on the weekend. So, um, yeah. And again, uh, it's not one of those things where people get to say, well, Marco, things like creeds and confessions and subscription to those things are really difficult, so we reserve that for the really mature people. No, we already said this is the coloring book. These are for children, right? As they grow older, they actually will begin to learn where they can safely disagree with those things, right? Not a single one of us agrees 110% with all of the confession within our circles, obviously. Some of us will say, yeah, there are rooms to improve, but we only get to say that when we have actually learned where those things are, right? G.K. Chesterton once said, um, if someone only gets to remove a fence once they know what that fence is there for in the first place, right? If you just let anyone don't understand a single thing about limits and borders, and they come around and they be like, "What's all these fences for? I want to play outside. I want to go out there." Um, then it's like you're the exact person this fence is for. Is to keep you in and not hurt yourself, right? And the fact that you don't understand that means this fence is not going away anytime soon. Um, and again, so okay, you want the fence to eventually disappear. You want more freedom. You want to have more unity eventually, less lines. Then you gotta teach them at a young age, right? We will have. I will. This is my indictment. The less willing we are to teach about those lines we are drawing against having those hard theological discourses, the more segregation we will have, whatever it is, theological, ethical, whatever. Right? The less willing we are, because as a personal testimony myself, I never shied away from a lot of really tough theological discourse when I'm discipling people in CF, and nobody is at each other's throats regarding theology, right? And so that's just proof to say that those things don't cause sectarianism inherently, but it will cause dissatisfaction if maybe I hide those things from them and they eventually learn, oh, Marco's not telling me everything. Right? There's all these rules that Marco refuses to uh, elaborate upon when I was younger, when he was discipling me. And now I'm learning that I shouldn't cross a bunch of them, and I don't like that. Right? Because I'm never taught to obey those things. I'm never taught to stay within the line and all those things. So I like discipline. Boom, there you go. Lack of discipleship. So yeah, and again, all this to finally give a definition of discipleship. I think discipleship essentially is ordering into further obedience in Christ. And that simply is it. Whatever area of life you have. Because Jesus said, uh, to disciple nations, right? We've all been through the
Mm-hmm.
text, Matthew 28. We all know what it says. It does not say make disciples, it doesn't tell you to make converts. It tells you to disciple the nations. To what end? To the obedience of Christ. He says, until all things obey Christ, right? Until they obey everything that Christ commands. Okay, so whatever it is, they are engaging in education, arts, uh, any kind of labor, any kind of work, any kind of ministry, your call is obedience. It's not necessarily to care about their feelings or to journey. Those are the things that happens in between, but those are blessings that you get when you what? When you actually obey all the things Christ commands. And if we refuse to do that, then we don't get to have any of those blessings. We don't get the community. We don't get the social and emotional security. We don't get the unity we always dreamed of and talk about. Those things are blessings. You don't get the blessings if you don't obey. So that would be my definition. Do you want to give your own operating definition, James?
I think it's just making people conform to the scriptures in terms of, I mean, it it is in terms of, I mean, non-gospel.
Hmm.
Learning more about the gospel, I mean, always living within the forgiveness of sins that the gospel gives to you, but of course, conforming yourself and growing in in conformity with God's law. I mean,
Yeah.
I
You
don't
don't.
think I don't think you can say I wouldn't say that you can. I don't think that there's nothing beyond that.
Yeah. You and
It's just straightforward.
the thing is just that you don't get one without the other.
Yeah,
You don't have gospel without uh God's law. So
yeah.
and that's the thing. Again, discipleship is actually that simple. It's just a question of are we willing to go through all the pain and toil and suffering that's gonna come with it, right? But as Jesus
My
said,
thesis. I
mhm,
mean, my thesis is that the church has forgotten to suffer, so no wonder
yeah,
we can't bear the pain of even this little thing called discipleship.
yeah, and so that's the unfortunate thing, right? Jesus said, if you don't take up your cross and follow me, you cannot be my disciple. And so the fact that we're unable to suffer in the same way he has suffered means we've lost the ability to be discipled and therefore disciple others. So uh, this is probably long. Our videos are always long, um, but hopefully this becomes helpful to all of our friends who are trying to actually define what discipleship should look like. And yeah, that's kind of it. Thank you all for listening. This has been Kingdom Cast, signing off.